I am looking for the patterns in the historical narrative itself that give us more insight into the world we live in today. So far, the patterns I found between 1945 and 1960 show events and people being manipulated for particular outcomes, benefiting the world powers at the expense of other countries and their people, and at the same time deceiving us about what was really going on to gain our consent. Like with the examples of partitioning one country into two, setting up two different political systems, and then instigating them to fight each other, like in the cases of Korea and Vietnam, and the inherent brutality against humanity of communism. Let's see what comes to the surface in our historical narrative of this nature between 1961 and 1980, those events about which we have been taught and which the older generations alive today have memory of happening, either from experience or the news. My name is Michelle Gibson. My starting point for seeing history with new eyes, 1961 to 1980, is the Berlin Wall. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered the Berlin Wall to be built in 1961 after 160,000 East German refugees crossed into West Berlin following major food shortages. Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet part of the country. As mentioned previously in the last video, during the Yalta Big Three conference held in February of 1945, the European Advisory Commission, or EAC, allowed each occupying power full control over its occupying zone, and the subsequent Cold War was reflected in the partition of Germany, as each occupying force could develop its zone on its own without influence from any overseeing body. Berlin was split into similar sectors. The Soviets took the eastern half, while the other Allies took the western. This four-way occupation of Berlin began in June of 1945. Subsequently, in August of 1961, the Communist government of East Germany, also known as the German Democratic Republic, began to build a wall of concrete and barbed wire between East Berlin and West Berlin. It was built ostensibly to prevent Western fascists from entering the country, but the even bigger reason was to contain the citizens of East Berlin, and made it harder for them to leave, not that they didn't try. Once the wall was constructed, the only access between East Berlin and West Berlin was via three checkpoints, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. On June 26 of 1963, John F. Kennedy delivered a famous address to a crowd of more than 120,000 in West Berlin, in which he said, "I am a Berliner." Also during John F. Kennedy's administration, United States tensions with Fidel Castro's Cuba intensified after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion between April 17th and 20th of 1961, when Cuban exiles invaded via a counter-revolutionary military brigade that was secretly funded by the CIA and included some U.S. military personnel and trained in Guatemala. However, the brigade was badly outnumbered by Castro's troops, and they surrendered after 24 hours of fighting. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place the year before Kennedy's speech in Berlin, which started on the 16th of October in 1962 and ended a little over a month later. It was a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is considered the closest the two countries came to full-scale nuclear war, when the Soviet Union deployed nuclear ballistic missiles to Cuba as a response to the United States deploying nuclear ballistic missiles to Italy and Turkey. An agreement was reached between Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro to place the missiles on the island in the summer of 1962 at Castro's request to deter future invasions, and the construction of missile sites on Cuba was confirmed by U-2 spy plane photos. After consulting with the National Security Council, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba on October 22nd in order to stop further missiles from reaching Cuba. The blockade was formally lifted on November 20th of 1962. After negotiations between the United States and Soviet Union resulted in the dismantling of their offensive weapons and a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba again. Civil war started in Guatemala in 1960 between the government and leftist rebel groups supported by the Maya and Ladinos, a distinct Spanish-speaking ethnic group who comprised the rural poor in Guatemala. Civil wars in Guatemala lasted until 1996. The military forces of the Guatemalan government have been condemned for genocide of the Maya and for widespread human rights violations against civilians, with some of the context being long-standing issues of unfair land distribution. Companies such as the United Fruit Company controlled much of the land in Guatemala, conflicting with the rural poor. The United Fruit Company came into being with the merger of Minor C. Keith's banana trading business and the Boston Fruit Company of Andrew W. Preston in 1899, and came to control large parts and transportation networks of Central America, and maintained a monopoly in certain regions which became known as banana republics, like Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica. The United Fruit Company monopolized all of Guatemala's banana production and export, as well as owning the country's telegraph and telephone system and most of its railroad track. The United Fruit Company has been described as an exploitative, multinational corporation that influenced the economic and political development of these countries in a deep and enduring way. The company known today as Chiquita Brands International came out of the United Fruit Company. It is interesting to note that in 1897, 2 years before the United Fruit Company was formed, the Central American Exposition was held in Guatemala. We are told it was constructed to highlight the railroad between Iztapa on the Pacific coast and Puerto Barrios on the Atlantic coast, but that for a variety of reasons, including the railroad not being finished at the time of the exposition, it was considered a dramatic failure for Guatemala. By the time of John F. Kennedy's death in November of 1963, there were 16,000 American military personnel in Vietnam, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place in 1964, an international confrontation after which the United States engaged more directly in the Vietnam War. The first Gulf of Tonkin incident took place on August 2nd of 1964 between ships of North Vietnam and the United States. The description of what took place is as follows. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached the naval destroyer USS Maddox and attacked it with torpedoes and machine gun fire. Damages said to have come about as a result of the ensuing battle were 1 U.S. aircraft, all 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and 4 North Vietnamese deaths, and 1 bullet hole on the naval destroyer, and no American deaths. There was initially allegedly a second incident on August 4th of 1964. This second occurrence has long been said not to have taken place. And then there are the people who believe the first Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened either. Whether or not the Gulf of Tonkin incidents actually happened, they were used as an excuse for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by Congress on August 7th of 1964, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to help any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be in jeopardy of communist aggression and was considered the legal justification for the beginning of open warfare with North Vietnam and the deployment of American troops to Southeast Asia, of which, with the institution of the draft, there were over 500,000 troops sent by 1966. Even the country neighboring Vietnam in Southeast Asia, Laos, had its own problems with the Vietnam War spilling over, with Laos being bombed by American planes starting in 1964, in retaliation, we are told, for the shooting down of an American plane by insurgents, after which bombing runs over Laos intensified, with over 100,000 bombing runs on Laos's eastern border with North Vietnam. There were numerous hot wars going on in other places in the 1960s in the aftermath of World War II. Too many to go into great detail, but this is a list of what was happening. The Portuguese colonial wars took place in the years between 1961 and 1974, involving the Portuguese military and nationalist movements in Portugal's African colonies, primarily in the colonies of Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. The Indo-Pakistani War in 1965, a 17-day conflict in September of that year between India and Pakistan that caused thousands of deaths on both sides and featured a large engagement of armored tank vehicles and the largest tank battle since World War II. The Six-Day War between Israel and the neighboring Arab states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria took place in June of 1967. By the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had gotten control of the Sinai Peninsula and the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. The 8-year-long Algerian Civil War ended in 1962, at which time Algeria became independent from France, but only after armed conflict between France and the Algerian National Liberation Front, involving guerrilla warfare, the use of torture, and civil wars between and within different communities of Algerians. Other examples of civil wars starting in Africa in the 1960s include the countries of Sudan, Chad, and Nigeria. There were 2 civil wars in Sudan. The First Sudanese Civil War lasted for 17 years, from the time tensions started to develop in 1955 to the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, between the northern part of Sudan and the southern Sudan region that wanted representation and more regional autonomy. During that 17-year period, over 500,000 people were estimated to have died. This is what we are told. The British government administered the primarily Muslim and Arab northern Sudan and mostly Christian and animist southern Sudan as separate regions under international sovereignty until 1956, at which time the two regions were merged into a single administrative region as part of British strategy in the Middle East, and without the consultation of the minority southern leaders, who were fearful of being absorbed into northern Sudan, for whom the British had shown favoritism, and tensions between the North and South escalated between the two. Following Sudan's independence from Britain, the Southern ruling class were powerless in the merged Sudan's politics and government compared to the Northern ruling class and unable to address the injustices against their people. Hostilities escalated, characterized by insurgencies and political turmoil, including infighting between Marxist and non-Marxist factions in the ruling military class. What is just war theory? The war must be for a just cause. The war must be declared with lawful authority. The intention behind the war must be good. All other ways of resolving the problem should be first tried. There must be a reasonable chance of success. The means used must be in proportion to the ends that the war seeks to achieve. How must a just war be fought? Innocent people and combatants should not be harmed. Only appropriate force shall be used. Internationally agreed conventions regulating war must be obeyed. The 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement was observed by Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie and led to more regional autonomy for South Sudan, and while providing stability for South Sudan for a number of years, it was only temporary with the onset of the Second Sudanese War. The history of Sudan goes back to the Pharaonic period of ancient Egypt, with the kingdom of Kerma in ancient Nubia, dated from 2500 to 1500 BC. The Egyptian New Kingdom dated between 1500 BC and 1070 BC. And the Kingdom of Kush, dated from 785 BC to 350 AD, with its royal capital at Meroe on the Nile River, where it flows through northeast Sudan in northeastern Africa. There have been roughly 3 civil wars in Chad since independence from France in 1960. The first one started in 1965 and lasted until 1979, and was waged by rebel factions against the authoritarian and corrupt regime of Chadian President Francois Tombalbaye. At the time of Chad's independence from France in 1960, roughly half of the population was Muslim and lived in the north and eastern parts of the country, and the other half was Christian and animist and lived in the southern part of the country. Apparently, President Tombalbaye was from the southern part of the country, granting favors to his political supporters in the south, while at the same time marginalizing the rest of the country. He also filled prisons with thousands of people he believed were his opponents, whether they really were or not. Tension and discontent grew, and several opposition groups started to organize a resistance movement. Initially, Tombalbaye's military crushed civilian demonstrations in 1962, and he relied heavily on French support to maintain power. The Chadian Civil War officially started with the Mongalme or Mubi uprising in September and October of 1965, involving a series of riots that started after a tax increase on personal income, which was tripled in certain areas. Local citizens accused the government of corruption and tax collection abuses. The military was sent in and crushed the riots, killing approximately 500 people. Thus began the 14-year-long First Chadian Civil War. Tombalbaye was eventually killed in a coup in 1975 and was replaced by the former commander of the National Army, Felix Malum. Malum was a southerner with strong kinship ties to the north who thought he could reconcile Chad's divisions. In the summer of 1977, rebels under the command of Gukuni Wadai and supported by Libya launched an offensive from the northern part of the country and was the first time modern Soviet military equipment came into the Civil War, forcing Malum to ask for help from France. After the 1977 Khartoum peace agreement, 2 Chadian northern military leaders, Hissène Habré and Gukuni Wadai, came together in order to oust the southern government of Felix Malum on March 23 of 1979. Then Gukuni Wadai seized power later that year and became president of the Transitional Government of National Unity, composed of northerners supported by different factions that were close to Habré. This state of affairs triggered the Second Chadian Civil War between 1979 and 1986. Chad in the modern day is one of the poorest countries in the world, with most of its inhabitants living in poverty as subsistence herders and farmers. Here's another way of looking at Chad and Africa. And Chad has sizable reserves of crude oil, which is the country's primary source of export earnings. The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, began in July of 1967 and ended in January of 1970 between the government of Nigeria and the secessionist state of Biafra, representing the nationalist desires of the Igbo people as a result of violence and repression against them by the Nigerian government after the British decolonized Nigeria between 1960 and 1963. Apparently control over the oil-rich Niger River Delta was also a strategic factor in the war. The Nigerian government used starvation as the weapon to win the civil war by blockading Biafra. A humanitarian airlift was organized to supply food to the people of Biafra during the years of the Civil War, but the whole conflict brought much suffering and death to the innocent. The Cultural Revolution in China lasted from 1966 to 1976. It was a violent social and political purge under Mao Zedong, Communist Party of China chairman, with the stated goal of removing traditional and capitalist elements from Chinese society in order to preserve Chinese communism. Soon, Chairman Mao called on young people to bombard the headquarters in schools, factories, and government institutions, apparently in order to eliminate his rivals within the Communist Party of China. He insisted that middle class elements in Chinese society who wanted to restore capitalism be removed through violent class struggle. The death of Chairman Mao in 1976 ended the Cultural Revolution. During this 10-year period, there was an estimated death toll of somewhere between hundreds of thousands to 20 million, and it severely damaged China's economy and traditional culture. Civil war started in Cambodia in 1967 and lasted until 1975. It was a war fought between the government forces of the Kingdom of Cambodia under Prince Sihanouk and the forces of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, known as the Khmer Rouge, supported by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Cambodia is in Southeast Asia, sandwiched between Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Prince Sihanouk's policies in the early 1960s initially protected his nation from the turmoil that engulfed Vietnam and Laos. His balancing act eventually went awry, with all of the forces at play during that time, and ultimately the Khmer Rouge seized power in 1975 and Prince Sihanouk was exiled. Between 1975 and 1979, Cambodia was ruled by Pol Pot, General Secretary of the Communist Party, and his Khmer Rouge Party, leading to the genocide of the Cambodian people, considered to be one of the bloodiest in history, in which an estimated 1.5 to 2 million deaths occurred, in part due to Pol Pot's goals of turning Cambodia into a socialist agrarian republic by forced relocation of its people to labor camps in the countryside. Many people were just taken out into fields and summarily executed, giving us the name of the Killing Fields, the title of a 1984 film about the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, based on the experiences of two journalists, one Cambodian and one American. The Troubles in Northern Ireland lasted from 1969 to 1998. Though the terms Catholic and Protestant were used to refer to the two sides, it was more of a political and nationalistic conflict that was fanned by historical events. Though there are differences of opinion on the exact start of the Troubles, two events in August of 1969 are generally agreed to officially constitute the beginning of them. The first occurred on August 12th of 1969 in Derry, Northern Ireland. That was the first day of what was called the Battle of the Bogside, a very large communal riot between residents of the Bogside area, a majority nationalist Irish Catholic community outside the walls of Derry. Fighting took place between the Catholic Irish Nationalists and the Royal Ulster Police, which was formed after the partition of Ireland in 1922, and Protestant Irish Unionists professing loyalty to the British Crown. The event which provoked the onset of hostilities was the occurrence of an Apprentice Boys of Derry parade, a fraternal Protestant society founded in 1814 to commemorate the 1688 and 1689 sieges of Derry, when there were two attempts by the Catholic King James II of England and Ireland and Seventh of Scotland, the first one of which was foiled by 13 apprentices. When the parade ended, fighting erupted between local Unionists and police on one side and Catholic Nationalists on the other side, and rioting continued for 3 days. Among other things, local boys, along with Catholic Nationalists, climbed onto roofs in order to bomb the police below with projectiles, which came to include stones and homemade gas bombs. The second event was the arrival of British troops in Bogside on August 14th of 1969. The unrest and violence of the Troubles escalated across Northern Ireland between the Irish Catholic Nationalists and the Irish Protestant Unionists for 30 years to come. Between 1971 and 1979, Idi Amin was Uganda's president. He was considered one of the most brutal dictators in world history, with his rule of Uganda characterized by rampant human rights abuses and persecution of certain ethnic groups and political dissidents, among other things. The 1972 Munich Olympics are remembered for the occurrence of the Black September Palestinian terrorist attack the second week of the Olympics, in which 8 terrorists took 9 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage after killing 2 of the team's members and a West German police officer. I remember this happening very well. I was 9 years old at the time and was enjoying watching the Olympic Games. Then this happened. The Palestinian terrorists demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, and the West German-held founders of the German far-left militant group Red Army faction, Baader and Meinhof. 5 of the 8 Black September terrorists were killed in a failed attempt to rescue the demanded hostages. The 3 surviving terrorists were arrested, but then released in a hostage exchange following the hijacking of Lufthansa Flight 615, a Palestinian terrorist attack aimed at securing the release of the 3 surviving terrorists. When the 3 Palestinian prisoners were released, the Israeli government authorized Operation Wrath of God to track them down and kill them. 2 out of the 3 were believed to have been killed. Looking back on the 1972 events at the Munich Olympics with what we know now versus what we knew then, I have to ask the question if this was an early false flag event. A false flag in our modern terminology is an operation committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on a second party. The Yom Kippur War was fought between Israel and a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria from October 6 to October 28 of 1973. Egypt led a surprise attack into the Sinai, territory it had lost to Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967, and Syria unsuccessfully focused on ridding the Golan Heights of Israeli soldiers. There was an Israeli counterattack, and it didn't happen. On October 26, the UN brokered a ceasefire between Egypt and Israel, ultimately leading to the first peace agreement being signed between the 2 countries in 1979. Meanwhile, the ceasefire exposed Syria to military defeat and Israel seized even more territory in the Golan Heights. Syria voted along with other Arab states in 1979 to expel Egypt from the Arab League. Another noteworthy fallout from the Yom Kippur War was the oil embargo that started in October of 1973. The Arab-dominated Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, proclaimed an oil embargo targeted at countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War, creating an international oil and gas crisis. By the end of the embargo, in March of 1974, the price of oil had risen by nearly 300% and had many short and long-term effects on global politics and economy. The overthrow of the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie took place on September 12 of 1974 in a coup initiated by a Marxist-Leninist faction in the military and marked the beginning of a 17-year-long Ethiopian civil war, which formally ended in 1991. The war left at least 1.4 million dead. The Solomonic dynasty, also known as the House of Solomon, was the former ruling dynasty of the Ethiopian Empire. Its members were lineal descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba through their son Menelik I, the first emperor of Ethiopia. Haile Selassie was the last emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974. The full title traditionally of the emperors of Ethiopia was Elect of God, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, and King of Kings of Ethiopia. The Iranian Revolution that took place in 1979 culminated in the overthrow of the last Shah of Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on February 11th of 1979, to be replaced by the Islamic Republic of Iran, with what is called a unitary, theocratic, republican, authoritarian presidential system subject to a grand Ayatollah. The revolution was supported by various Islamist and leftist organizations, as well as student movements. So things changed considerably for the people in the Islamic Republic of Iran after 1979. This picture of the citizenry was taken in 2012. And these pictures were taken before the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Central American crisis started in the late 1970s with the eruption of major civil wars in the Central American countries of Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The U.S. government was deeply involved in efforts to prevent victories by pro-Soviet communist forces in these countries. The Georgia Guidestones were unveiled on March 22nd of 1980 on a rural site in Elbert County, Georgia. Engraved on each face of the 4 large upright stones, in 8 different languages, was a message containing 10 principles or guidelines. The very first guideline was maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. What was up with that? The remaining guidelines sounded positive, but were they really? Whoever was behind the Guidestones was unknown. There were apparent focuses of population control, eugenics, and internationalism engraved on the Guidestones. I am happy to report that as of July 7th of 2022, the Georgia Guidestones are no more. One was mysteriously destroyed in an explosion, and the rest were subsequently demolished. Do the same patterns continue to emerge between 1961 and 1980 that we saw between 1945 and 1960, showing events and people being manipulated for particular outcomes benefiting the world powers at the expense of other countries and their people, like with the examples of partitioning one country into 2, setting up 2 different political systems, and then instigating them to fight each other, like the cases of Korea and Vietnam, and the inherent brutality against humanity of communism. Among other examples in Sudan, we saw the former British colonial government arbitrarily divide the country into the primarily Muslim and Arab northern Sudan and mostly Christian and animist southern Sudan in 1956, and then create the conditions for protracted civil war by showing favoritism to the north and oppressing the south. And in Chad at the same time of its independence from France in 1960, roughly half of the population was Muslim and living in the north and eastern parts of the country, and the other half was Christian and animist and living in the southern part of the country, and the conditions for civil war were created with an authoritarian and oppressive dictator who showed favoritism to the southern part of the country and marginalized the rest of the country, in both cases leading to great suffering and death of the civilian population. As we saw in the previous video, between 1945 and 1960, at the same time India was liberated from British rule in 1947, the country was partitioned into the Hindu-majority Union of India and the Muslim-majority Dominion of Pakistan. 10 to 12 million people were displaced in forced mass migrations to the newly constituted dominions and created overwhelming refugee crises, as well as large-scale violence, thereby establishing the conditions for suspicion and hostility between these 2 countries that has existed into the present day. This movement of people started after India's official Independence Day from Great Britain on August 15th of 1947. Wouldn't you think a country's independence would be a great cause of celebration instead of a hellish nightmare? In this video, we saw the communists take down hereditary rulers in Cambodia and Ethiopia, also leading to great suffering and death of the civilian population. Then the Islamic Revolution took down the hereditary Shah of Iran to replace him with the Islamic Republic of Iran, leading to the severe repression of the civilian population in all ways. All of this signifies that who or whatever is behind what has taken place here does not value human life and instead has sought to violently destroy it. It certainly seems like there was something bigger going on with all of these activities behind the scenes, and that they were not random occurrences. I think we are seeing the unfolding of a plan that definitely does not have the best interest of humanity at heart, and only benefits the power and control-hungry few that have been manipulating events behind the scenes to control or destroy the original people and their advanced civilization,